This is Amna Heather, and you are listening to Tethered Minds. In this week's episode, we will be making sense of the elusive phenomena a lot of you have probably experienced. Deja vu. Maybe you were able to put a word to it. Or maybe it was just an odd feeling that you really couldn't put your finger on. We're going to explore how deja vu can shed light on the mysterious ways that our memory works, and what those malfunctions can teach us about who we are. For most of us, deja vu is a fun, curious experience. But for Miles, deja vu was far from that.
So I was at a party with some friends, and I decided, hey, you know what? I'm gonna smoke some weed. And I took 3 rips from a bong, not a whole lot, and I sat down on a couch, and the best way I can describe it is like TV static came over my head, and it was like the most intense deja vu that I could ever describe just came over me. It was like I was living in an infinite loop, and it's all going to come back to this exact moment in time, and then it's going to happen again and again and again for all eternity. And this panic set in on me, and I started to freak out. And so I started to try to break out of the loop. I started to be like, okay, what would be something that I would do that's unexpected? So I would try to flick my hand really fast. But wait a second, I remember doing this the last time I was in this loop. And then I remembering, and this lasted for about an entire hour. And it was the worst experience of my life.
Miles was 24 when this happened.
And so after that night, I calmed down after about an hour. But there was a weird thing that happened afterwards. Now I had chronic deja vu. And it wasn't like this unending, earth-shattering, lack of free will, infinite loop, TV static deja vu. It was this, just the regular deja vu that you experience day to day. I would go out to town, I would go out to a restaurant, I would see a sign, boom, deja vu. I would have a conversation with somebody, and I'd be telling a joke, boom, I'd be like, I'm having the same conversation that I had. And it was happening every single day, no matter what I was doing. And I'd be like, I know, I have never done this before, but I'm getting that sensation.
How often is this happening to you?
I was experiencing this several times a day. And so I'm trying to figure out what's going on here. So I get online and I start Googling stuff. And I start finding out that deja vu could be a symptom of neurological issues. So I went to some walk-in clinics. I went in there, I was like, yeah, I think I'm having some neurological issues. And they're like, okay, well, what's your symptoms? And I was like, deja vu. And they looked at me and they were like, get out of here. And they sent me home with some anxiety medicine. It's happening at this point on and off for hours at a time every day.
After a few months of this chronic deja vu, Miles felt like he was getting better.
I was like, okay, I'm starting to get my life together and stuff. Everything's starting to go good again. And then, in the middle of the night, I had that weird thing where it's TV static starts in the back of my head, free will goes away, and it's the horror of realizing that everything is just this infinite loop, nothing is real, I'm going to live, die, and everything repeats itself. And then the chronic deja vu came back in full force. And I'm like, what was that? I haven't touched any substances.
This cycle of chronic deja vu for days or weeks, followed by these severe TV static episodes, went on for months. During this time, Miles had seen a therapist and multiple doctors, but he still had no answers.
I'm having earth-shattering experiences every couple of months. This is bad. I need help. And so finally, I get in contact with an actual neurologist. He is scheduling me out 2 months out and everything. I'm just great. My friendships are getting strained. My family relations are getting strained. I'm not even sure if I'm going to be able to hold my job at this point because it's all I can think about. My life is basically falling apart.
We'll be back with Miles' story in a bit. Deja vu is French for already seen.
It's the feeling of finding something familiar, but knowing that familiarity is wrong or misplaced or not quite right. So one of the really important aspects of the experience is that it draws attention to this feeling that you have that you know to be incorrect.
And unlike what Miles struggled with, For most people, deja vu is a fleeting, exciting experience
yeah, it's a pretty healthy and, if not fascinating, cognitive experience.
That's Akira O'Connor. He's a renowned researcher that makes a living from the difficult task of studying déjà vu.
Researching anything that happens infrequently is difficult, right? Because you either have to be watching and waiting for people to have it in your lab, ready to kind of pounce when it happens, or you have to find ways of kind of reliably generating it in your lab so that you can bring people in and just do your work with those people, safe in the knowledge that you're able to generate the experience kind of reliably with them.
And while people have tried that, there's a whole bunch of issues with generating déjà vu.
Now, that's if you're doing it in the lab.
There's another way to understand what's going on. And that's to find someone stuck in a déjà vu loop like Miles. And while Dr. O'Connor would have loved to study him, Miles couldn't even get anyone to listen. Not therapists, physicians, or even the people close to him. That is, until his appointment with a neurologist came around.
Finally, we got to see the doctor, the specialist, and I went in there, and I was hoping to finally get some answers. Finally, somebody sat down. He was actually willing to listen to me. And I explained to him everything that had happened. He didn't say a word while I was explaining everything. And after I got done explaining everything, he looked me in the eyes and he was like, "You know what? I have experienced some déjà vu myself in the past. And the solution for me was to get a good night's rest."
Oh my god, I'm so sorry people didn't take you seriously.
It's so, like, irritating and dehumanizing when, like, people just don't listen to your, like, symptoms and your medical problems. And, like, I know it's, like, not just for me, but for other people. For one, I was just like, yeah, okay. At this point, I was starting to get it into my head that there was nothing wrong with me. When every single doctor tells me there's nothing wrong with me, I start to doubt myself. But then right before the end of the meeting, he was like, "You got insurance. Well, if it'll put your mind at ease, we'll go ahead and we'll put you on the EEG machine and we'll scan your brain and we'll let you know that there's nothing wrong with you."
Which sounded amazing.
So a week later, he put the little diodes on my skull and they sat me in a little room. And for like 30 minutes, I just laid down on a little bench. And this was one of the mornings where I wasn't experiencing chronic déjà vu. I was actually really pissed off because I was like, if there was ever a time I wanted to experience déjà vu, it was in that room while the tests were going on. The test was over, I got up, and I just felt so stupid, so silly, and I got up and I left.
They had a routine follow-up appointment scheduled to discuss his test.
And I sat in that waiting room. I was literally on my phone because I was just like, yeah, whatever. Like, they're going to tell me there's nothing wrong with me. I'm going to go back to the office and try and figure out how to maintain my job, how to make something of my life with this new condition that nobody believes that I have. So the nurse comes in and she was like, "Okay, so I've got a list of medications here and blah, 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 blah." She starts rattling them off and I'm a little bit confused. I'm like, do you have the right room? But she's rattling them off, and she's like, "This one does this one does that." I'm like, stop. What is this for? And she goes, "Well, honey, you have seizures, and you have them really, really bad. On your test, for that half hour, you had 6 seizures on that table." I'm like, wait, what? Which is very bizarre, because I don't exhibit any other symptoms. I don't have, like, the muscle spasms. I don't have difficulty speaking or any of that. I just have this one symptom, and it's just intense déjà vu.
Like Miles, I'm also familiar with déjà vu. I used to frequently get bouts of something I called the weird feeling to my parents since I was 6 or 7 years old. As early as I could remember, if I'm being honest. I didn't have the words to describe it when I was young. But the best way I could describe them was this weird, out-of-body experience that simultaneously felt like an intense déjà vu, coupled with this ecstatic fear. Kind of like I was on a roller coaster with a real sense of rising in my stomach. It would last a few seconds, but I knew it was odd. Fast forward around 20 years, I was pregnant with my first child, and while sleeping, my husband said that he heard me yell out the most horrifying primal scream, followed by a thud as I fell to the floor. blood foaming out of my mouth and shaking uncontrollably. That was my first grand mal seizure. A few months later, after having a baby, the same thing happened. Another bloody mess. This time, I'd also peed in my pants. And according to Dr. O'Connor, a lot of people who experience persistent déjà vu discover that there's something neurological going on.
Okay, so déjà vu has been investigated and noticed for hundreds of years. So people have written about the experience in religious text, but it wasn't until the 19th century that it was identified as a cognitive experience worthy of study. And that was by a French physiologist who had a patient present to him, patient Louis, who remembered everything he was experiencing as though it was a memory, even though it was happening to him live. Now, really interestingly, that experience of déjà vu, and this is reported by a French physiologist, which is why we get the French name for it, déjà vu, already seen. That experience of déjà vu is actually a clinical experience of déjà vu. So we kind of take the name for the everyday experience from the clinical manifestation of it, rather than the other way around.
Can you tell us a bit about the relationship between the normal déjà vu that most people experience with this clinical version of it?
So I think that the interesting part of that lies perhaps in one of the ways it does cross over with the kind of healthy déjà vu experience, in that a lot of people will experience a sense of anxiety or a sense of dread as they are experiencing déjà vu, even if it's a fleeting experience, an experience that happens once every 4, 5 months, whatever. So what might be happening in people that are experiencing déjà vu very, very frequently would be that experience of anxiety and dread is kind of occurring, and then it's not being allowed to dissipate because the déjà vu isn't dissipating. So you're just getting this feeling of anxiety that builds up and up. And of course, if you're experiencing this strange cognitive phenomenon and you can't seem to escape it, that anxiety isn't just a weird, irrational experience, but it actually becomes quite rational.
And there's a biological reason for why anxiety could be a part of déjà vu in the first place.
We know that some of the origins of the déjà vu experience lie in the temporal lobes within your brain.
The temporal lobe is a large section of your brain that sits behind your ears and is responsible for memory, language, and a whole bunch of other things.
Now, the temporal lobes are quite close to the amygdala, which is associated with all sorts of emotional feelings, including anxiety. So it may very well be that what's happening is you're getting this activation in your temporal lobes, causing déjà vu that spreads ever so slightly to the amygdala, causing anxiety. And you get this co-occurrence of these two things based on how closely they are aligned within the tissues of your brain.
Mm-hmm. So it's basically a spillover effect from the memory retrieval part of your brain to the anxiety-producing part of your brain, which is right next to it. So moving on, I want to talk a little bit about your leading theory of what causes déjà vu, which is that it's a memory error.
Yeah, so it's exactly that. It's an erroneous feeling of familiarity that then gets shut down by what we know to be true about the rest of our experience of the world.
And Dr. O'Connor thinks that the fact that it's a memory error points to one area of the brain as a culprit for déjà vu.
The temporal lobe is super important for any memory researcher out there. So the structure you hear most about is the hippocampus.
You can think of the hippocampus as a small structure deep in your temporal lobes that's important for laying down and retrieving all of your memories.
Now, what's interesting is that around the hippocampus, which is kind of nestled away in the middle of the temporal lobe, are lots of other brain structures that are associated with aspects of memory that aren't necessarily the laying down and the retrieving of memory, but that may well be associated with signaling that a memory is being retrieved. So these feelings of familiarity and of recollection. And so those bits of the temporal cortex that are not quite central to hippocampus, but nestled in around it, it's those feelings, I think, that are what we experience when we experience déjà vu.
Basically, it's possible that there's some other brain structure in the temporal lobe that's responsible for giving us that feeling of familiarity that we experience with all our memories. It's hard to imagine a memory without a feeling of familiarity. And if something feels familiar without a memory, well, that's déjà vu. Another reason this temporal lobe hypothesis makes sense is because a lot of the people who get this déjà vu with seizures, like me and Miles, have what's called temporal lobe seizures, aka this familiarity producing part of their brains start going haywire.
And what I think might be happening in people who are experiencing déjà vu as a result of temporal lobe epilepsy is that you have this focus that starts very near the center that signals familiarity. That leads to a feeling of déjà vu becoming part of the set of sensations that happen before the seizure develops into a full-blown seizure that takes over large portions of the brain.
Lots of people who have temporal lobe epilepsy say that they know a seizure is coming when they start experiencing déjà vu.
Any of us who've lit fireworks and that fuse has fizzled out. That's what should happen, right? In people, I guess, who don't have epilepsy, there's going to be all sorts of focal points that just don't amount to much. And I think the thing about any kind of epilepsy is that those errant misfirings go on to start much bigger cascades of reactions in the rest of the brain.
What Dr. O'Connor thinks is that people without seizures can still occasionally get random twitches or misfirings in the part of their temporal lobes that signal familiarity.
Taking a step back from that also, you could ask, well, what's causing those twitches? And this is like any error within your brain. That preliminary error is almost like a twitch you get in your eye when you're tired. And we know actually déjà vu to happen more when we are tired. Why should a neuron in the brain be any different from a neuron in your face or in your arm or anywhere else in your body? They make more errors, they run into more problems when we're deprived of sleep, when we're dealing with all sorts of other kind of perturbations to a healthy homeostatic system.
The only catch here is that déjà vu mainly occurs when you're younger, and less often as you age.
Well, if it's happening more when we're younger compared to when we're older, then it's probably not a major memory error, because we tend to experience more major memory errors when we're older. Lapses, forgetting, those kinds of things happen more as we age.
But déjà vu isn't just a feeling of familiarity.
You have a feeling of familiarity that you know is a mistake.
And the key is that you know it's not true.
So what is going on with déjà vu? Well, it might be that it's one of these excitatory misfires in your brain. Your brain signals familiarity when it shouldn't. It gets overexcited. But what's really important is your fact-checking regions of your brain. They catch that and they say, hang on a minute, this isn't quite consistent with what I know to be true about the rest of my life. So instead of viewing the overall experience as an error, you could view it as a really successful error monitoring and error checking process.
In other words, older people might not catch the error in familiarity and just write off déjà vu as something they've genuinely experienced before.
The predisposition is just to go with the familiarity, as opposed to the predisposition in someone who is young and experiencing a healthy déjà vu experience might be just to reject that as a curiosity. A lot of the reports that you get from people with déjà vu associated with dementia are that they turn off the television when they experience déjà vu. They complain to the BBC that the BBC is always showing repeats, even if it's an original program they were watching.
Dr. O'Connor has also looked into another interesting idea. You see, our brains are split into two hemispheres, our left and our right, and each of our eyes sends information to opposite sides of the brain. That visual information is processed independently in each hemisphere before it comes together for you to perceive a complete image of something. Normally, your left and your right eye are in complete sync. But in the popular book Catch-22, the author suggested that during déjà vu, they might be temporarily out of sync. That recognition, then, would actually be because a part of your brain really has seen something before you're consciously aware of it. And it's telling you, hey, slowpoke, we've already seen this.
I read that book when I was a PhD student. I thought, well, surely there's ways of testing that. We could speak to someone, for example, who doesn't have visual input.
And so, that's exactly what Dr. O'Connor did. They spoke to a 25-year-old man, let's call him Michael, who had been totally blind since birth. If déjà vu, already seen, really was because of a delay in visual experience, could someone with no visual sense still experience it?
We found that, they still experience déjà vu, so it's not that optical delay explanation.
Couldn't it be a mistiming in other senses, like auditory or tactile?
Yeah, I mean, that's where the argument goes from there, right? So it could be that you have delays that are associated with each of the senses. Or it could be that this is happening in a higher order place within our cognitions.
Michael, who didn't have his sense of sight, described one of his déjà vu experiences as a vivid combination of multiple senses. He said, "Hearing and touch and smell often seem to intermingle in the déjà vu experiences. It's almost like a photographic memory, without sight, obviously. It may be more accurate to say multi-dimensional memory, as if I was encountering a mini recording in my head, but trying to think, where have I come across that before?"
And what I suspect is happening is that we're just overlaying these feelings of familiarity onto whatever sensory experience we're having when we have that erroneous familiarity experience.
Mm-hmm. And these are just some of the neuroscience explanations. I've also heard a lot of other ideas. For example, it could be a glitch in the matrix, a sign of reincarnation, a premonition. Do people get upset when you tell them that this amazing metaphysical thing that they've experienced is just a brain error?
Absolutely. So I get a lot of emails from people telling me that what I've decided based on my research isn't true because their one experience tells them that they have lived a previous life, or where they view that they have some idea of clairvoyance. It's a really compelling feeling, and I totally get it, because those déjà vus I have where I feel like I can predict what's going to happen, it's on the verge of my kind of conscious awareness and I never quite get to it in time. Those feelings are so compelling, and to be honest, that's one of the reasons why I was drawn to studying this experience in the first place.
This is a feeling that has made its way into all sorts of movies and books in different ways. In the movie The Matrix, when Neo feels he's reliving a scene of a cab passing by, he considers this a sign that there's a glitch in the Matrix.
Oh, déjà vu.
What did you just say?
Nothing, just had a little déjà vu. What is it?
A déjà vu is usually a glitch in the Matrix. It happens when they change something.
In Fight Club,
Deja vu, all over again.
Edward Norton's character's déjà vu seems to be because of his unstable mental condition.
I was living in a state of perpetual deja vu.
The only thing is that all the examples and histories of déjà vu that I'd run into seem to be Western. And my quest to understand why led me down a really interesting path. So let's backtrack for some context. One of the things I want to do throughout this podcast is to shed light on the non-European perspectives and histories of things. We often are already familiar with the Western ideas, and a fresh take can often lead to some pretty great insights. So I started talking to people about whether or not they had a translation of déjà vu in another language, or how the feeling was interpreted. I asked friends of friends, I posted everywhere I could, I got on calls with elders from different countries, and I ultimately asked hundreds of people. But no one had anything for me. It seemed like the French word déjà vu from the 19th century was the only word that people knew of that specific experience. The closest translation I could find seemed to focus on different aspects of the experience entirely. Whether that was religious, metaphysical, or even in one case, an auditory echo. But the craziest part of this expedition was that I did find some people who had never heard of the term déjà vu at all. So I described the feeling as best I could, and I asked them, have you ever experienced this before? And they all said that they don't think they have, or what they had experienced aligned more with the words for it that do exist in their language, which were often spiritual in nature. Now, I could have been asking questions the wrong way, or maybe I asked the wrong people. So I asked Dr. O'Connor for his thoughts. And by the way, if any of you have any translations of déjà vu in another language, or any thoughts on this, please do let us know.
Well, this is a really fascinating line of inquiry, because I have always been based in my research in, I guess, a Western English-speaking context. And aside from the fact that we use a French word for déjà vu, everything else seems to be pretty uniform in how people talk about this experience.
So what would be your explanation? Do you think that our culture shapes the way that we actually perceive déjà vu?
It might be that as soon as you ascribe these characteristics to this fragment of a feeling, you start noticing more and more about it in ways that you don't necessarily. If that language is more geared towards describing it as another sort of experience, for example, as a religious experience.
And it could be that putting a word to something primes the way that you think about it and the associations you make with it.
We know that people don't tend to start reporting déjà vu experiences until they're at least about 5 years old. Now, does that mean they're not experiencing déjà vu up to that point? Or does that mean that at 5 they have the language and perhaps even the cultural tools to start thinking and talking about this? And I just found it so interesting that these experiences are now so common or so kind of part of our cultural vernacular that they've made it into some of the most popular films of the past 20 years.
I want to be careful about this because this whole language shapes thought idea has been used to make some pretty racist conclusions in the past. So we'll dig deeper into that in another episode. But regardless of how you interpret your déjà vu experience, it can teach us a lot about how our brains work.
We're used to thinking about our conscious experience as being almost like the flow of a river. One thing naturally flows to another, and you can't tell one part of the river from another. But what déjà vu tells us is that actually this river of consciousness is made up of these different components. And as soon as you start experiencing them out of order, you stop having this kind of unitary conscious experience, and you start realizing that actually my experience of the world is a kind of accident of how things normally work.
There's also a few other states like déjà vu where your ordinary experience of the world breaks down.
Yeah, so déjà vu, already seen. There's a related experience called jamais vu, never seen, which is where people experience a lack of familiarity even when they know they should experience familiarity.
What's extremely interesting is that temporal lobe seizures can also trigger jamais vu, even though jamais vu is pretty much the exact opposite of déjà vu.
A lot of the time when I describe jamais vu to people, it doesn't necessarily resonate with them until I ask them to think about what happens when they write a word over and over. I don't know, if you were ever naughty at school, you might have been asked to write lines, and if you were particularly concerned with efficiency, you might have written your line down the page rather than across. Just focus on one word, do all thes to start with, and then do all of the next word, and so on. What people often report when they're writing a word over and over is that that word starts to break apart. It starts to not flow as a word.
Dr. O'Connor's colleague did an experiment where they asked people to do exactly this. Write the word door 30 times in 60 seconds. By the end, 68% of them started to doubt that door was even a real word. If you want to pause this podcast, you can try writing or saying the word tethered over and over again to see if it loses its meaning.
Tethered.
And then there's the other related experience, presque vu, almost seen, which can also teach us a bit about déjà vu.
So presque vu is... Okay, so I've described it as this kind of false feeling of insight, but a touch point for people who might be struggling to imagine what that feels like. If you've ever had a dream where when you wake up and you feel like this makes sense of everything. It's what I need to do at work in order to be better at work, or it's what I need to do in order to solve this situation that is happening in my life. And then you have your breakfast, you meet your work colleague, or you try to talk about this with someone in your family, and what made sense before just feels like a collection of random thoughts now. That feeling is most like presque vu. I think it's the least common of all of these allied experiences.
Dr. O'Connor only has one experience of presque vu that he remembers.
It was a super weird experience where I was going up an escalator on the London Underground, and I just thought, oh, this is it. This is life. Life is just going up and down escalators. And it made so much sense to me until I tried to text my friend that I'd just solved everything with this analogy. And then all the meaning kind of just broke apart, and it felt super weird.
I love that. That's like half my thoughts. Meaningless things that feel so profound. What about déjà vu, though? Any experiences of that you remember?
I had an experience of déjà vu when I was studying it for the first time. I was running my first experiment on it, and I remember being in my student house and looking up through the skylight and seeing a bird just fly over the skylight. It was very similar to the kind of Matrix experience where Neo sees the cat, but I saw a bird fly past the skylight, and I just remember thinking, not just that bird, but this whole situation feels totally familiar, but I know it isn't, and I know it isn't because I'm studying this experience, and it can't be familiar to me. And so it was a kind of quite a meta experience.
It must feel that much more special, right, as a déjà vu researcher?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's also coincided with me experiencing it less as I've aged. Joseph Heller in Catch-22 talked about wanting to nourish the experience with the curiosity that the characters in the book had for it. So now I really do try and nourish those experiences because I know that each one might be my last.
For everyone listening, I hope that you nourish your next déjà vu too. There's so many different aspects of the experience that you can isolate and pay attention to. Whether it's the feeling of anxiety that accompanies it, what the familiarity really feels like, which of your senses get involved, how long does it last, and so on.
I think déjà vu is a lovely example of stuff being on the way to breaking, and in doing so kind of revealing its inner workings. This idea that your memory and the familiarity that you have, they usually go hand in hand, and they're usually part of this kind of unitary experience that feels so coherent. You can't ever imagine having a memory without also having a feeling of familiarity.
As rare and odd an experience like déjà vu can be, it has a lot to teach us about our very consciousness. And what's more, the words we use to describe the feeling can shape how we understand it. In a future episode, we'll be talking to a couple of cultural linguists to explore that idea a bit more. That's all for today with Tethered Minds, and we'll see you next episode.
By the way, I just launched this podcast. If you like what you've heard so far and would like to see some more, please subscribe and share. It means a lot.
You can check out our website, tethered-minds.com, to see some of our upcoming episodes. All the resources we've cited can be found there as well. Thank you.